In tonight with news from the January 6th committee. We now know the final public meeting will be held next Monday, December 19th. The committee will hold a vote to approve its report summarizing their findings about Trump and his allies' attempts to overturn the 2020 presidential election and announce any criminal referrals to the Department of Justice. The final report will be released publicly 2 days later on Wednesday, December 21st. Which brings me to a Republican House member from Georgia. And no, I'm not talking about Marjorie Taylor Greene, who in the fall of 2020 was still a QAnon Facebook troll who had been elected in rural Georgia, but hadn't been sworn into Congress yet. Instead, I am talking about this guy, Congressman Rick Allen. And I know many of you may not know who he is. He's represented Georgia's 12th congressional district since 2015. And according to Talking Point's memo, he's one of the members of Congress who worked most aggressively behind the scenes to overturn Donald Trump's election defeat. According to more than 24 text messages TPM obtained between the congressman and former White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows, his efforts included passing unproven YouTube conspiracy videos from Romania to the White House and pressuring Georgia's Secretary of State. It's all part of more than 2,000 text messages TPM obtained that Meadows turned over to the January 6th committee at the end of last year. And while some of those text messages have already been revealed by various media outlets, the new reporting describes the scope of the more than 450 messages shared between Meadows and at least 34 members of Congress as they plotted to overturn the election starting on election night and going through President Joe Biden's inauguration. It's the latest evidence showing how broad the effort was within the elected membership of the Republican Party to find some pretext, just anything at all, to change the 2020 election results. Talking Point's memo describes the text as rife with links to far-right websites, questionable legal theories, violent rhetoric, and advocacy for authoritarian power grabs. In one text sent a week after the 2020 election by Arizona Republican Andy Biggs, who is running for House Speaker in the next Congress, Biggs raised debunked claims that a substantial number of illegal immigrants cast ballots. In another text on December 26, 2020, Pennsylvania Republican Scott Perry, who later sought a pardon, texted, "We got to get going," saying election denier Jeffrey Clark should be installed as Attorney General, since any position below that will, quote, not have the authority to enforce what needs to be done. In one text from the day before the attack on the Capitol, Ohio Republican Jim Jordan, a leading member of the House Republican caucus, pushed the plan to have Vice President Mike Pence refuse to certify Biden's victory. And in another text, just 3 days before Biden's inauguration, South Carolina Republican Ralph Norman writes in part, "Our last hope is invoking martial law. Please urge the president to do so." Now, we should point out that NBC News has not independently confirmed the text published by TPM, and the full context of the replies from Meadows aren't always clear. What does appear clear, however, is that while the text showed varying degrees of involvement by those members of Congress, the communications provide an explanation of how Republican members participated in undermining people's faith in democracy, and how many of them bought into the fantasy that Trump had actually won, ultimately riling up a crowd that became violent and attacked the Capitol, where they were also forced to run and hide. Perhaps more concerning is that a number of these same insurrectionist members of Congress will find themselves elevated to positions of power when Republicans retake control of the chamber in January. And joining me now is Hunter Walker, one of the investigative reporters for Talking Point's memo, who reviewed those texts to Mark Meadows. Hunter, it is good to see you. Let's go into this because let me just read you one text. This is a text to Mark Meadows on January 5th. This is right before the insurrection. And this is from Representative Rick Allen of Georgia. "Mark, thought the president might want to tweet this. I will send you the text chain between me and Raffensperger. Bottom line, Dominion machines down in multiple polling precincts in Columbia County, my Republican stronghold. This should give the president the ammo he needs to go after Raffensperger." Now, long lines and machines being down, been there, done that if you voted in a black precinct. That's not like an uncommon thing. But it feels like Rick Allen's texts, I have a bunch of them here, they speak to a kind of conspiracy theory that it seems like he and others believed, that God was involved, that there was some sort of religious war going on and that it involved everything from satellites out of Italy to Dominion, all conspiring to keep Donald Trump from being president again. Did you get the sense from reviewing these text messages that these Congress members believed it, or that they were just saying it to keep Trump in?
Well, you're getting at the million-dollar question there. Were these people just power hungry, or were they true believers? And, I can't get in anyone else's head, but I'll tell you the texts bring you pretty darn close. And what we saw with Rick Allen is someone who was just, buying into absolutely the wildest stuff online. I mean, in one case, he was talking to someone who he repeatedly claimed to Meadows was a quote-unquote source, a high-level official, someone in intelligence. And when he finally seemed to be presenting the information that he was gleaning from this, allegedly high-level contact, it was basically a YouTube video posted by a Romanian anti-vaccine activist that was completely evidence-free. And then an article from 2005 about a data breach of driver's licenses. So, if he wasn't in on the joke, he was, displaying comprehension issues and a basic lack of information literacy that's frankly alarming. What's also alarming is the ease with which, foreign materials and questionable stuff online. We saw members of Congress sharing stuff from InfoWars, from websites with white supremacist ties, profane names, how easily this stuff made it to the highest levels of the Trump administration. That one from Allen that you brought up where he was talking about, the debunked Dominion conspiracy, actually made it to Trump's Twitter page on January 5th, the day of the Georgia runoff and the day before the attack on the Capitol. We saw other instances where, Brian Babin, a Texas congressman, who's another one of these, marginal figures in the MAGA extended universe, who nevertheless was, extremely extremely aggressive in their correspondence with Meadows, both in terms of the volume and the content. Meadows was referring wild stuff Babin sent him to the DOJ. So, this was utterly deranged logic and conspiratorial stuff that, whether they believed it or not, was resulting in real official action by the former president and those closest to him.
I mean, there were, conspiracy theories about 100,000 Ukrainians being shipped into the United States to vote illegally. I mean, it really got really detailed. In the case of your new reporting, I want to let you talk about your new reporting because Dick Morris is invoked here, and the focus seemed to be on trying to get either Arizona or Georgia to be the lead state in causing the election to be overturned. But they also seem to believe in the legal theory that we've heard about and the January 6th committee has put forward, that the states could simply send their own electors. Talk about the newest reporting.
Yeah, so, the first person in the Meadows text log, and this was first reported in The Breach, a book I co-wrote on the January 6th investigation with one of the former staffers on the committee, the first person to bring up January 6th was Don Jr., and he sent a message to Mark Meadows with some variation of that alternate elector strategy. And Meadows said, we're already working on that in several swing states. One thing you see when you look at the full text log, and again, a lot of that's being revealed for the first time on Talking Point's memo, there was a House team, as Meadows described it. Jim Jordan seemed to be a clear leader on that front. Ted Cruz was identified as leading the Senate objection. Then they had contacts in multiple local states, including Pennsylvania, Georgia. In some cases, local legislators. One state senator in Georgia was texting Meadows directly. But all of this did seem to be focused on that idea that they could kind of just wipe out the will of the people and send in their own electors. They were, coming up with various pretexts for that. They were lobbying for that. They were also directly pressuring the governors, namely Doug Ducey in Arizona, who Andy Biggs said he pressed at the request of Trump, and Brian Kemp in Georgia to, certify the alternate slates. And I think, for me, one of the things that really sticks in my head after weeks and weeks of reviewing these messages is that in a couple key instances, including with Vice President Mike Pence and those governors, if just a few more people had been willing to go along with these strategies, we don't know what could.
could have happened. Let me bring in, stay with me just for a moment, Hunter. I want to bring in Congresswoman Madeleine Dean of Pennsylvania. She was a 2021 impeachment manager. And when you go back and think about the fact that all of you were terrorized and terrified on January 6th, based in part on conspiracies from YouTube videos and other sources that your fellow members believed and were pushing, and that Mark Meadows was entertaining. I just wonder what your reaction to that is as a member of Congress and as a former impeachment manager.
Well, here we are coming up on a second anniversary of January the 6th. So I'm very pleased to be with you tonight. And thank you, Hunter, for your continuing reporting. Two things that strike me is, number one, I have the ability to speak with the current presidential administration. I have to admit to you, I can speak to the current administration at top levels. It would not be hundreds of emails about political things. It would be about policy. I hope that mostly people understand that legislators should be talking to the chief of staff about policy initiatives we're trying to move forward. The other frightening thing to me in reading this reporting, Hunter, is how many of these folks, of course, are still serving in Congress. As we, the Democrats, slip into the narrowest of minorities and the Republicans slip into the majority, imagine that these folks, 34 of whom were rabidly texting the chief of staff, hundreds of emails going back and forth, that these folks are now slipping into the majority. I hope the American people realize the line that should have been drawn many, many years ago between the politics and the policy. And of course, these insane theories that were for one thing only. They were not to try to right an election that was wronged. They are to try to hold power for one person. And of course, they are clinging to the power of that one person for their own power. That's it.